T-34 Calliope. This was a World War II Sherman tank fitted with a massive rack of 60 rocket launch tubes above the turret, turning one of the most common tanks in the American arsenal into something that looked more like a musical instrument than a weapon of war. It was developed in 1943 with the rack physically linked to the barrel of the Sherman's main gun, so that pointing the gun also aimed the rockets, allowing a single crew to operate both weapons in coordination. It was named after the Calliope steam organ, a reference to the cluster of parallel tubes that gave it such an unmistakable appearance. The noise produced when all 60 rockets launched in sequence was reportedly enough on its own to send enemy soldiers running, and it was used in small numbers across several armored divisions in the last year of the war in Europe. War Tank America. This was a steam-powered flame-throwing tank developed by the United States during World War I, a project that combined almost every bad idea about armored vehicles into one enormous machine. It was designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in collaboration with MIT and powered not by gasoline but by a pair of Doble steam engines producing around 500 horsepower, since steam technology was still considered competitive with internal combustion at the time. Instead of a gun, the primary weapon was a flamethrower mounted at the front, designed to project flaming fuel oil at German fortifications. Only one was ever built, and although it was driven through parades to boost morale on the home front, it was shipped to France for evaluation and went nowhere, as the war ended before it could be deployed. T-95 medium tank. This was a prototype Cold War tank that tried to solve several problems at once, and ended up demonstrating why solving several problems at once is so difficult. Developed between 1955 and 1959 as a possible replacement for the M48, it incorporated composite armor, a smoothbore gun, and an experimental electronic rangefinder called OPTAR that fired pulses of infrared light to measure the distance to a target. The OPTAR system was mounted in pods that protruded visibly from both sides of the turret, making it look as if the tank had grown mechanical ears, and the scattered light pulses it produced were unreliable enough that crews had to guess which return signal was correct. Despite these shortcomings, the T-95 is historically interesting because it pioneered concepts that would later appear in far more capable form in the M1 Abrams, including composite armor and electronic fire control. M60A2 Starship. This was a tank that looked like something from a science fiction film, but turned out to be one of the most unreliable vehicles the U.S. Army ever fielded, an attempt to arm a conventional hull with the ability to fire guided missiles as its primary weapon. Built on a standard M60 Patton hull, it made it a low-profile futuristic turret fitted with the same 152mm gun launcher as the Sheridan, giving it the ability to fire anti-tank missiles at distances well beyond what a conventional tank gun could reach. It earned its nickname from its oddly shaped saucer-like turret, which looked genuinely futuristic even for the 1970s. The combustible casing problems that plagued the Sheridan followed it onto the Starship, and the complex electronics and missile systems were so difficult to maintain that the Army eventually stripped the turrets off all 526 of them and sent the hulls to be used as bridges. MBT-70. This was a joint American and West German project to build the ultimate Cold War tank, launched in 1963 with enormous ambitions, and canceled less than a decade later in a state of expensive chaos. The two nations agreed to share equal input on the design, then almost immediately began arguing about engine choices, caliber of the main gun, whether to use metric or imperial measurements, and how much the finished vehicle should weigh. What emerged was technically remarkable, featuring a hydropneumatic suspension that could kneel or raise the hull on command, a 152mm gun launcher capable of firing both shells and Shalala missiles, and a fully automated loader. Most bizarrely, the driver was seated in the turret rather than the hull, rotating with the gun in a capsule that always faced forward, which testers found so disorienting that many reported motion sickness. The Germans eventually walked away and built the Leopard 2. The Americans redirected the funding toward what became the M1 Abrams, and only 14 prototypes were ever built. T-28 Super Heavy Tank. This was America's only true super heavy tank, a nearly 100-ton armored behemoth designed in World War II to smash through the most heavily fortified positions imaginable. It was conceived in 1943 when American planners feared that cracking the German Siegfried Line would require a vehicle capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy any conventional tank. What makes it immediately bizarre is that it had no turret at all, mounting its 105mm gun in a fixed casemate at the front, and it ran on 4 tracks rather than 2, giving it the wide, low silhouette of a very angry armored turtle. The vehicle missed the end of the war in Europe and was never used in combat, and the Army subsequently lost track of one of the prototypes for approximately 3 decades before finding it sitting in a field at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Christie M1931. This was a tank that could remove its own tracks, drive on its large road wheels at speeds that embarrassed purpose-built automobiles, and then put the tracks back on when it reached the battlefield. It was designed by the brilliant and famously difficult American inventor J. Walter Christie, who spent the 1920s and 1930s convincing anyone who would listen that speed was the ultimate virtue a tank could have. What set it apart was a convertible drive system that linked the rear wheels to the engine when tracks were removed, allowing the vehicle to reach around 70 miles per hour on roads with an aircraft engine providing the power. The U.S. Army bought a handful but never fully committed to the concept, which proved to be one of history's great missed opportunities, since the Soviet Union bought Christie's ideas and built the lineage that eventually produced the T-34. M551 Sheridan. This was an airborne light tank meant to give American paratroopers the ability to jump from aircraft and immediately have access to a weapon capable of destroying a main battle tank, which is a more complicated engineering problem than it sounds. It was developed in the 1960s around a 152mm gun launcher that could fire either conventional rounds or a Shilalesh anti-tank guided missile down the same barrel, giving a very lightly armored vehicle an outsized punch. The problem was that the combustible ammunition casings, designed to eliminate the need to eject shell casings in the cramped turret, had a troubling tendency to smolder and ignite the next round prematurely. Soldiers called it the Johnny Reb for reasons relating to fire, and while it suffered in Vietnam, it was later parachuted into Panama during Operation Just Cause, making it the last tank ever deployed by parachute in American military history. T-14 Assault Tank. This was a joint American and British project to build a single heavy assault tank that both nations could share, an ambition that sounded sensible on paper and collapsed in practice for reasons that rhyme uncomfortably with the MBT-70 story 2 decades later. It emerged from a 1941 meeting between American and British officials who agreed that neither the M4 Sherman nor the Churchill tank was armored heavily enough to punch through the kind of fortified positions they expected to face, and that building one shared solution was more efficient than each country developing its own. Britain promptly signed an order for 8,500 of them in 1942, even though only 2 were ever built. What makes it strange is the gap between its ambitions and its results. It weighed 41 tons, moved at only 17 miles per hour, thanks to a Sherman drivetrain being asked to push a much heavier vehicle, was prone to throwing its tracks, and had armored skirts covering the suspension that made replacing those tracks extremely difficult. By the time testing was completed in 1944, the Churchill had improved dramatically. American doctrine had moved on entirely, and the entire program was quietly canceled with both prototypes discarded, though one survives today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England.